Thank you all for having me again. If you were here last month or a month and a half ago now, this is looking familiar, and I apologize. But I actually teach a class in the history of the civil rights movement. About 20 years ago, well, 18 years ago, I figured, well, here's this course that's been sitting in our curriculum for decades, and nobody's taught it in the history department. And I was really into social movements and the history of the civil rights movement especially, and so I figured, okay, I'll revive it. So I've been teaching this class for 18 years. Yeah, all right, thank you. Well, maybe I get everything wrong, though, and then you're going to say, don't ever teach that again, right? It's kind of a difficult test, though. I mean, maybe you would think, well, Carla can't do it, and so it'll be really easy. But let me tell you, my head is swimming now because, I want to do 54 hours of talking with you about this, and then we'd have a final exam, and that would be that, right? But I got to do 1 hour, and some of you who were here last time know that I have more. I only have 100 slides this time, so not 150, and I'm only going to do, I'll hopefully be done around 6:35, 6:40, about 40 minutes or something, and then we'll hand it over to Dessalines, and he'll do his thing, and then we'll have some time for conversation, I hope. But there's so much I wanted to say, and it's hard to boil it down. But I figured I'd just start by asking about the civil rights movement. Let's maybe just think about some of the major figures, major events in the civil rights movement that you're already aware of, that you kind of remember from high school or college, from your classes. Can we just have somebody give me an event or a figure that you're familiar with? Medgar Evers, okay, yeah. All right, so Medgar Evers, head of the NAACP in Mississippi in the 1960s. Who else? Yeah. Leonard Peltier just got his sentence commuted. Yeah, all right, yes. Ella Baker. We'll come to it later, but I might as well say it right now. My favorite quote in all of civil rights history: strong people don't need strong leaders. I love that one, and we'll get to that maybe a little bit. Yeah? George Jackson. All right, who else? Yeah? Bayard Rustin. Another person who's kind of connected with Ella Baker a lot. Nobody's mentioning the big name. How about an event? One of the big events in the classical movement, in the classical era of this thing. Anybody? What's that? The Million Man March, okay. Oh, the sit-ins. Yeah, in a way, when you talk about major figures or major events, you think of these things as flashpoints and not as long-term sort of organizing. So you think of leaders and flashpoints rather than thousands and thousands or millions of organized people and not an event, but a long, long struggle. And I think sometimes there's a tension when you're talking about the history of the civil rights movement, especially if you have to have a multiple choice exam about the civil rights movement. You want to talk about dates and people and events, but what you want to get across to people is a long struggle of hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions even of people moving to create a better world, to end. And in the case of the Southern African American civil rights movement, that sort of classical story that we tell, what we're talking about is getting rid of Jim Crow, getting the right to vote finally, all of those kinds of things. These things are long-term kind of stories. And what we do sometimes, I think, that's kind of a problem, is we tell a kind of official history of the movement. Official history of the United States, an official history of the movement. And the labor movement discussion, a lecture I did the other day was sort of the same thing. We tell an official history, and then there's this other history that you might have that I think we need to start talking about a little bit. There are official commemorations and official memories of the movement. And sometimes, I mean, I like holidays. I love holidays. And I think the holidays are good. I think commemorations are good. I'm fine with statues to some people. I don't mind that stuff so much. I like it. But being an angry historian, I'm going to complain about it as to start with this. And then I'd like to spend a good bit of my time going over some major events in the movement, events that you're probably familiar with, events that you talk about even at my guess is the elementary school level, but certainly the high school level. And in an intro to American history class, you'll talk about these kinds of events. But I want to always challenge the familiar story that we know, and then try to end with some kind of general idea of some sort of lesson that we might take into today. So I think about, like, for instance, the King holiday. I think it's great to have a holiday for King. I think it's good to have a memorial. I think that's fine. I don't want to say that it's not. But when we choose to celebrate historical figures, I'm always reminded that how we choose to remember them, how we choose to remember the past, tells us a lot about the present. Historical holidays, historical memorials give us a little bit of insight into how we create and commemorate a kind of collective memory. You don't have to memorize it, but it's, the memory of the country, supposedly. It's a process of kind of official national memory making. And you see it here in this monument to King. Again, I think it's great that we have it. But it does put me in the mind of this quote. Who controls the past controls the future. I use this quote in every single one of my classes at some point. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Anybody know where that's from? And if you were in one of my classes, don't say. It's from 1984, the dystopian novel by George Orwell. And it's a scene where O'Brien, the sort of symbol of Big Brother in this totalitarian state, is talking to this guy Winston and basically saying, hey, repeat after me. This is our slogan. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Anybody ever read 1984? All right, good. What did Winston, the main character, what was his job? Does anybody remember his job in that book? I mean, before, of course, his brain is eaten. Yeah. He'd rewrite the history. He's the one controlling the past to help the party control the future. And if you control the present, you can hire the guy or put somebody in charge of controlling the past. His job was literally, and you've probably heard this term just in conversation, but his job was literally to throw the past down the memory hole. Right? It was this furnace. You take all the old records, all the old newspapers and all of that kind of stuff, and you just burn them and then write new ones and just have this fake history. Now, of course, and one of the things when this actually comes up in the book, he's being tortured. And Winston says, well, you can't stop memories. You can't stop memories. They're in my head. And he's like, and the response is, no, I suppose not. But you can. You can stop your own memories, and you don't have the discipline to do it, is basic. So it's this kind of real serious brainwashing going on, even your memories. Right? Well, we don't have that here. We don't have that kind of thing here. In America, it's a little bit more complicated. Orwell is writing about a totalitarian future controlled by Big Brother, no dissent allowed. And in our world, it's not so simple. After all, we built a monument to one of our greatest dissenters. Martin Luther King, Jr. It's on the wall, and it's on the mall in Washington, D.C., no less. surely this shows how much we honor dissent in our country. Who controls the past controls the future, right? But I'd like to say not so fast. I think we see something of the same kind of process that Orwell was talking about, even when we do this. We don't throw things down the memory hole. We don't erase the story entirely. Instead, we elevate them to officialdom. And in the process of elevating some people to official heroes, what we do is we empty them of meaning, or of their real historical import sometimes, or at least change their meaning. At one point, some folks were trying to talk about turning Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land" into a national anthem. And I remember seeing this, that song, "This Land Is Your Land." They wanted to turn it into the national anthem. And I remember seeing an interview of Pete Seeger, and he says, well, no, Woody Guthrie would have hated that. He would have hated for anything of his to have become official. To be stamped, all right, this is the song. What happens when you turn folks official is you turn them into something that everybody supposedly can embrace, and I think take them out of history. So you take a figure like Martin Luther King Jr. and build up a spectacle of commemorations, and we talk about the dream, which is great. We say these words that everybody can say. It seems like it's the words that people on a certain part of the spectrum, it's the only ones they know of his, about judging people not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, or "Let Freedom Ring," or "Free at Last," or "Drum Major for Justice," all of those kinds of phrases. But in building up this pageant of commemoration, we leave out the context and begin to veto things from history, throwing parts of the story, I think really important parts of the story, down the memory hole. I always go back to think about, throughout my career, how many people, students and just people in the neighborhood will talk about some historical figure and say, well, I really love that person because they stood up for something. They stood up for something. And my immediate response in my head, I don't say this, but in my head is, well, so did Hitler. Right? So what did you stand up for? And for me, at least, sometimes we veto that when we talk about a king. So you end up getting something like this. This was several years ago now, but I still love this one. And every year when King's birthday comes around, you'll see the FBI and other places tweet how much they love Martin Luther King. Yeah, now that he's dead, they love him. But anyway. Yeah, I just turned it off because I didn't want you to read it while I was making this really important point. But I love this one, Dr. King's dream for the global strike team. Right? Barksdale Air Force Base. This was 10 years ago. Dr. King would be proud to see our global strike team comprised of airmen, civilians, and standing side by side, ensuring that the most powerful weapons in the U.S. arsenal remain the credible bedrock of our national defense. It goes on, right? We must look, and it's talking about diversity and all that stuff, which is wonderful. Maintaining our commitment to the global strike team, our families, and our nation is a fitting tribute to Dr. King as we celebrate his legacy. You might be in favor of the global strike team or against the global strike team, but if you know much about King, you might get an idea that maybe this isn't a fitting tribute to him. After all, well, we'll come to another quote of his maybe later on. All right. Well, in that context, the monument to King that I showed earlier and is up right now is actually pretty fitting. Instead of a stone of hope emerging from a mountain of despair, which is what this statue is part of a speech of his, right? A stone of hope out of a mountain of despair. We have a frozen figure, not really emerging from the mountain, but merging with it in a way. It's kind of historical sterilization, I think, sometimes when you see that kind of stuff. I think we should avoid that. But doing it is tough to avoid. It's tough to avoid that. Heroes lend themselves to narrative. And I think lots of people in the civil rights movement are should be considered, heroes, of course. But heroes, you can see them almost march across the page. They a pageant of history, the march of history. And so what we do is we had this sort of traditional story that we tell, and then what we did was, you get these Washington, Adams, and so on. We throw in Frederick Douglass. We throw in, a king, to sort of diversify the story, but still it's just a pageant of superheroes. And we still disappear. And then every once in a while, some people try to throw in somebody else, and it's like, well, maybe not him yet, right? But I think Malcolm X has come close to reaching that. Whoops, my goodness, there we go. Well, we leave a lot on the cutting room floor, and to me, the most important thing we leave on that cutting room floor is the story of social movements that gave these official leaders their moral force and which gave them their real power. All of that just disappears in that pageant of history, the pageant of heroes. That brings me to this nice little quote, which fits with Orwell, I think, the idea of even your memory we're going to take. The struggle of humanity against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Milan Kundera, he wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being, a novelist in Eastern Europe back in the 60s and 70s and so on. But I love this one because history is a kind of memory, and sometimes our collective memory, it kind of vetoes our own sort of memories here. And to recover those memories takes some other kind of effort. In recent years, we've had people, we won't get it. We've had people tear down statues to the Confederate, so-called heroes of the Confederacy, right? And people say, well, you're erasing history. I see that as exactly this. People actually struggling to recover their memories that have been buried by a kind of official history that left them out, that vetoed them. Well, all right. So I'm going to take the rest of my time in this talk to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement and the way we talk about individual heroes and how to maybe suggest other ways of looking at it. I'm going to go through the big names and events of the classical history here that you're probably all familiar with, but then suggest some sort of ways to investigate a little bit more about how ordinary people built a movement that sort of, instead of being led by these folks, ordinary people built a movement that threw up those leaders. Threw up those leaders? I don't know that word. That pushed those leaders to the fore, right? By the way, this is a great book. It's a really, really cool book. She goes through not only the history of a lot of the stories that you've already heard. Jean Theoharis is a historian she's written a couple of biographies of Rosa Parks and other folks who are big-name folks, but she tells a different story. But I love this title, too, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. And A More Beautiful and Terrible History, that's a quote from James Baldwin talking about the history that's kind of missing here. And we see it right away. In a regular class, we start our story. We talk about the civil rights movement happens, at least the way I was taught, and hopefully it's starting to trickle into high school and even K through 8. A more complicated story. Periodization. When is the civil rights movement? Well, we usually say, among American historians, 1954 to some other time, but usually if you're going to try to get some consensus, you'll say 1968. So 14 years, this is what we talk about, 1954 to 68. But when we choose our starting point is a clue to our assumptions about what is important in our story. So, 1954, anybody? What happened that we go, okay, this is the play button? Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education. You have that story of the Supreme Court rules that you can no longer have segregated schools, right? Segregated schools, separate is inherently unequal, is what they say in that. A big moment, but when we press the play button in 1954, first of all, we kind of forget the 30 or 40 years of activists and lawyers too, joining together to try to build up to that case. But we also kind of say, well, it's the Supreme Court that's actually the player here. That's the actor, and that other folks aren't necessarily the actor. And then when we get to 1968, what happened in 1968 that we say, all right, well, that's the end of the movement?
Civil Rights Act?
There's the final big Civil Rights Act there. Yeah, it's housing rights, which also had this real crackdown built into it on demonstrations, just so you know. So it's like one of the first war on crime acts, too. Kind of weird. But what else? What else happened in 1968? The assassination of King. So Supreme Court, big-time leader that is embraced by the white community more than any other of those leaders. Right? There's your story. There's your bookends. Well, what I want to encourage you to think about is the long civil rights history. A civil rights history that begins, you can begin it almost anywhere. You can begin it in 1619. You can begin it in 1789 when the Constitution is ratified. You could begin it in 1812 when thousands of enslaved people run to the British lines to be free. You can start it in 1860 if you want to, with the crisis that leads to the Civil War, 1863, or Reconstruction. In other words, that civil rights movement has been going on for generations and generations. But even the one that we normally focus on, the story of Brown versus Board of Education or King, we got to stretch that back at least to the 1880s and 90s and talk about the way people resisted all of that time. And I'm not going to do it in here, but this is one of the things I want you to think about. All right, in a way, the movement of 1954 to 1968 is the tip of an iceberg. The very tip of an iceberg, and you only see the tip when you're on the surface of the water. You kind of forget that there's a mountain of ice beneath it. And that tip of the iceberg isn't what sinks the Titanic of white supremacy or Jim Crow or whatever you want. It's the mountain of ice. That's the thing. And so, and just as we have to go way, way, way back to talk about this civil rights movement, and I'm focusing here on the African American movement for freedom here, we have to also bring it way, way, way forward to now. When I first learned about the civil rights movement in high school in the 1980s, and in college in 1988, I was thinking back of it, thank God I'm in the 1980s. We're so much more, we are so not racist now. Right? You know, this is all ancient history, right? That was a long time ago. 20 years earlier was a long time ago. Oh man, how wrong I was. It was yesterday. It's today. The past isn't, past at all. And of course, every 5 years we get a real punch in the face. Actually, every day almost these days, we get a punch in the face telling us that the history of the civil rights movement, the legacy, isn't that at all. It's present right now. I wanted to start telling you a story about the Brown versus Board of Education. By the way, I did a talk last year on labor and civil rights, and I tried to make sure that none of these slides are the same, just so you know. It's a different story, all right? But Barbara Johns, here's one of my heroes of the civil rights movement, Barbara Johns. Anybody familiar with this young woman here? Barbara Johns. This is a story about Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education wasn't just one case, it was several cases. And one of them was her case. Barbara Johns was in Prince Edward County, Virginia in the 1950s, well, growing up in the 1940s and 50s. and she and her friends were in a segregated school that had, a auditorium that doubled as a cafeteria, that doubled as a classroom, that had leaks and all that kind of stuff. They didn't have a bus, the white folks did. They had all the stories you've heard, all the hand-me-down books or no books at all, while the white folks had the new books, all of that kind of stuff. Clearly not even separate and equal, which is what it was supposed to be, but certainly separate and unequal. And she says, well, let's go on strike. And so they did. She and her 9th grade fellow students went out on strike. They walked out. In 1951, they didn't tell their parents or their teachers. Take my class and I'll tell you the whole story. They go out on strike. They say, well, we need a new school. And then the NAACP came in, and their parents had to ask the question, do we support these kids or do we, punish them? I mean, they're sticking their necks out and sticking our necks out by extension, right? Well, they end up supporting those students, and this became one of the cases that's Brown versus Board of Education. They won years later, 1954, right, when they win. This case gets taken up. Barbara Johns, for her part, her family was attacked. Everybody in her family lost their jobs. She had to move. She moved all the way down to Montgomery, Alabama, to move in with an uncle because she might be killed for doing this. When the case was ruled on in the end, Prince Edward County, Virginia schools said, all right, now that we have to integrate, what we're going to do is we're going to just shut down our high school. If we have to let black kids into our high school, we're not going to have any public high school at all. And they took all the teachers and administrators and they set up a private school. And the state of Virginia passed a law allowing for vouchers so that people could take their public school money and go to a private Christian academy, the Prince Edward County Academy. And now we've got our little racist school here and no school for the black kids at all. That's what they did in response to it. And that's what they did all over the country in response to it. In other words, when we press the play button here, Supreme Court bans segregation in public schools. When we say, all right, well, we had this problem of segregation in schools. The Supreme Court swoops in. That's done, right? With no more segregation in schools. No, in a way, that's just starting. Now you actually have to do it. You have to enforce it. You have to do what you need to do to build these new institutions. And what you're going to find is an enormous amount of resistance to it. That little girl, if she's from any deep South state, if she's from Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, if she's from one of those states, she will never go to school in an integrated school. None of those states obeyed the Supreme Court while she was, until she was like in her 20s. So that's that longer story that we need to tell. And sometimes it gets very, very depressing. It's like, do we win? Answer, no, you don't win. There's no permanent victories. You have nice little moments of victories, but no permanent victories. The guy who argued the case, there we go, Thurgood Marshall, first African-American Supreme Court justice. The guy who heard the case, very first case he ever heard as a Supreme Court justice, he was never really, he was our governor. This is Earl Warren. By the way, Earl Warren presided over the imprisonment of the Japanese American population here during World War II. And in his biography and other biographers, they say, well, when he got in to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he devoted himself to civil liberties precisely because he saw what he had done back then as wrong. He's trying to earn his way back into heaven. But he did this. He and those other folks, they ruled on this case. How did the rest of the people who appointed him feel about it? Well, Dwight Eisenhower, a few years later, in talking about Earl Warren, said appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. Right? So there you get an idea of what you're up against. The political response in the South, I've already gone over it. This was their official slogan in Virginia and elsewhere. Massive resistance. We will never, 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 never submit. That was the political response in the South. Now, okay, the political response in the white South among the white racists in the South. There were lots of folks in the South who, of course, supported all of this stuff. Black Southerners, huge numbers of African-American Southerners, but also a few white Southerners too. So I don't want to just say, all right, the South does this, but that among the South's leaders, massive resistance was the name of the game. Massive resistance means they had the Southern Manifesto. We will never submit to this. Strom Thurmond, who was my senator when I lived in South Carolina, he's around for over 100 years. He passed this thing around saying we'll never submit. Proof, by the way, proof that the good die young. Anyway, almost every Southern congressman and senator signed this thing. Almost every single one signed the Southern Manifesto. We are going to resist. And of course, that was tested at Little Rock, which you're probably familiar with. You've probably seen, how many of you have seen that picture before? It's one of the most famous of the whole movement. By the way, they're the same age. They're both 16 years old. That woman yelling at this woman here. Eckford, right? She was here about 10 years ago. That was really cool. Nice big talk she gave. Little Rock had to be integrated by the 101st Airborne. What happened? The next year, kind of forget this too. The next year, Little Rock closed its high school. We're not going to... Now, they had a big fight politically, and then the following year, they finally opened their high school in an integrated manner again. But they just said, all right, if we're going to have to integrate, we're going to shut it down. Oral Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, who kind of sparked this incident, he was voted number 10 in the top 10 most admired people in the world by Americans in a poll done by Gallup during this crisis, to give you an idea. Let's move to the next one, the Montgomery bus boycott. The first real story of serious direct action, right? We're not talking about the NAACP in the courts. We're talking about other organizations engaged in direct action, a boycott, an act of civil disobedience of a kind that sparks a boycott. And there's Rosa Parks right there. Read that Jean Theoharis book on the rebellious life of Miss Rosa Parks. It's really something else. Read the book. By the way, send me an email. I'll send you my bibliography of a couple hundred really good books on civil rights. But you know, the story I was told, and thankfully, I think this story has gotten a little bit better. My students, when I kind of quizzed them about this, they learned it a little differently than I did. The way I learned it was Rosa stood up, this kid sat down, and King saved the day, right? That was the story, right? And, or rather, Rosa sat down, the kid stood up, and, well, anyway, enough. But the story was, here this tired seamstress, after a hard day of work, doesn't want to give up her seat to a white person on the segregated bus, and so she says no. And the police come, and she says, take me to jail. And that's how this thing starts, right? Hopefully, those of you who are a little bit younger, the way you were taught this, hopefully you got a little bit more of this story. Maybe a little bit more of the story of Rosa Parks' life of activism long before she ever did this. Her partner was an organizer for mine, mill, and smelter workers. She worked to save the lives of the Scottsboro Boys, the biggest case of the 1930s. She worked to get white men tried and convicted for sexual assault against black women, something that the white community was always fearful of black men against white women, but never the opposite way around. She was active in those movements long before she sat down. And like many of these folks that you hear about in the movement, they were trained. You know, the anti-folks, the anti-civil rights folks in the South would say, well, these outside agitators, they're not like everybody else. They've been trained. This is a conspiracy. That's what's going on. Well, in a way, they were right. There were lots of folks who were trained as organizers, and thank God for that. This is one of the places, the Highlander Folk School up in the hills of Tennessee. Miles Horton and all sorts of other folks, bringing folks in, training them to be, not really, he didn't even use the word training, but anyway, Miles Horton of the folk school. Almost everybody of prominence in that early Southern movement went through there. This is a picture of a meeting at the Highlander Folk School. Obviously put up by people who are against the civil rights movement, right? It's a communist plot, right? There's Martin Luther King right there. There's Rosa Parks right there. This guy, by the way, is a communist, this guy here. Anyway. The greatest education comes from action, and the greatest action is the struggle for justice. I love that line by Miles Horton, and it gets at that idea of organizers and the sort of foot soldiers of the movement, I think. And you see that in this, that's the Highlander Folk School a few years ago. Thinking you can burn down an idea? Well, anyway. But when you begin to look below the surface at a lot of these activists, what you find is a whole huge group of women who have been politically active for years, who do all the sort of day-to-day work of the movement. Joanne Robinson, she was a local professor. When you got to print flyers, you got to have flyers for the movement, right? She liberated thousands and thousands of copies from her college. Got in trouble for it too. Liberated copies. I think I heard that from somebody talking about this. I always say that to my students. I'll liberate some copies for you. So it costs money. It costs money to make flyers. Well, anyway, Joanne Robinson, Johnny Carr, Vernon Johns. This is who Barbara Johns moved in with. This guy. Interesting figure here. He was a minister at a church, and it was her uncle, minister at a church in Montgomery, Alabama. And she moved in with him after she's run out of Prince Edward County, Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns himself was kind of controversial even within the black community because of his activism. A lot of people in his church were very much, look, we need to be calm here. We need, we don't want you making waves, bringing bad attention to us, and all of that kind of stuff. And they ended up firing him, saying, we got to find somebody who's respectable, somebody who we can trust to be really good steward of this church without getting us in trouble. And they hired Martin Luther King. Anyway. But Johns went to Oberlin in Ohio. Oberlin was a site of the abolition movement 100 years earlier. This is the long civil rights movement at work. Home to fugitive slaves and the Underground Railroad. Claudette Colvin, maybe some of you have heard of her. She sat down on the bus before Rosa Parks. She was a much younger person, a student of Rosa Parks in the NAACP youth group. She sat down on the bus, and it's actually her case that actually goes through the courts, not Rosa Parks's. E.D. Nixon, all these folks. A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union. She had some connections. These folks, we might not know who they are, but Rosa Parks knew these folks. They were about the only white people in Montgomery, Alabama that were really sympathetic to the movement, and it was very useful. He was a lawyer in the New Deal. He knew a guy, what's his name, Franklin Roosevelt, and she was a good friend with Eleanor Roosevelt. So 1 degree of separation between Parks and the First Lady of the United States of America. Well, let me move on. I said I would do these things quicker. We got lots and lots of folks moving in, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, all these kinds of folks. There's Rustin. The proof that one truly believes is in action. He proved it. He sat down all the time on the buses and so on. Got kicked off all the time for years and years before this. There we go, Ella Baker. out of this movement, Ella Baker becomes one of the leaders of the Southern movement, even though she's from New York. Strong people don't need strong leaders. Her notion basically was, look, if you help people to organize themselves, they don't need to be led. They will create the change that they need. You got to be organized, but if you're a strong person, you can stand up, and you don't have to wait for somebody to come in and save you. That's an important thing, and you see that a lot, I think, in the bus boycott itself. I mean, these are the big movements. I mean, these are the big moments. And of course, there's resistance. You see what I'm doing? I'm going through all this stuff really fast. I told you I had lots of slides. Oh, there's Parks. I love that one. But look at her smile. Isn't that? You may have seen this one before. I used to have this kind of stuff, and then the internet came along, Google came along, and anybody can get this stuff now. By the way, this is when they got busted for running an illegal taxi service, their carpool system, so that they could boycott the buses. You know, that's when these are all the leaders getting busted for that. There's King. The police morgues, they call them a morgue, where they have all the mugshots. The police morgues of the South are the place where you're going to find some of the greatest heroes in all of American history. Actually, I would say the police morgues almost anywhere. You're going to find a lot of the great heroes of American history. Ordinary people fighting back and maybe, having to spend a little time or getting your home bombed, that kind of stuff. All right. The student movement, 1960. What I said 35, I meant 40. We'll go to 40. But the student movement, 1960. Again, these folks, it's the folks who did the sit-ins. I love this, Diane Nash. She's one of the greatest of this. How many of you have heard of Diane Nash before? I'm hoping a few. Yeah, a few. All right. We presented Southern white racists with a new set of options, she says. Kill us or desegregate. Ball's in your court. Really quite a statement there. These were the big lunch counter sit-ins, and these new what seem to be new sorts of tactics. But what we're talking about here is tens of thousands of 18, 19, 20-year-old adults pushing back against a system that had been built decades earlier and saying, we're not going to take this anymore. And yeah, thousands go to prison, go to jail for it. If you've ever read Coming of Age in Mississippi, there's Ann Moody right there. She's this woman here. They formed that group, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. There's John Lewis, who died just a couple of years ago. I keep on saying this in my classes. There's that guy, he died. James Lawson, he was here a few years ago. He died. Anyway. Bayard Rustin. Well, one of the other big moments here was the freedom rides. The freedom rides. We're going to take buses, interstate buses, across state lines, down into the South, and test whether or not the government is going to let us ride in an integrated fashion. We're going to have white folks go into the so-called colored waiting room, and black folks go into the so-called white waiting room, and then we're going to see what will happen. And you might know the story. What happens is a lot of these folks get attacked and beaten by KKK folks. Their buses get firebombed. They meant to kill the folks here, but the driver is like, hey, I'm not one of these guys. So they open the door. Otherwise, they would have killed those folks. There they are in Birmingham, Alabama, where the police absented themselves for 15 minutes, allowing the Klan to come in and beat everybody up. Jim Peck. The SNCC students, they're like, well, wait a minute, these guys quit. The core folks quit, the SNCC students come in, and they take the bus all the way to Jackson, Mississippi. And in Jackson, Mississippi, they're told, all right, it's over now. And they said, well, no, it's not over. And so they kept on bringing bus after bus after bus after bus. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of people. Again, foot soldiers, right? And if you like the morgue that time, here's another one. Jackson, Mississippi. There's James Lawson. He trained all these folks. There's Stokely Carmichael, right there. Later on, the leader of the Black Power movement there. And then, of course, the big one, Birmingham. Notice, we haven't gotten to any of the laws, and we're not going to. I'm going to swiftly go through a ton of slides. But what I'm trying to say here is that look what builds up to this. And then you have a teacher say, Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson's the hero here, signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the big question I always have with that is, who put the act on his desk? There's no way Lyndon Johnson would ever have supported this stuff if he didn't have to, if he wasn't forced to. And he's forced to by a mass movement of people. And a mass movement that's not that mass for a long, long time. It's like a bunch of foolish little people over here that everybody says are nuts, and they're doing this thing for years and years, and then all of a sudden it kind of grows. And Birmingham was that moment. Birmingham was that moment. Thousands and thousands of people in the streets, kids in the streets, fighting for freedom. Freedom now, by the way, is the slogan, right? Freedom now. Integration now probably wouldn't have gotten too many people out in the streets, but freedom now, There are some kids going to jail, which they held in prison. They held hostage for several $100,000. Finally, Kennedy delivers a civil rights speech. That's when they do it, at Birmingham. And then, of course, the response in the South, Medgar Evers is murdered the very night. But I wanted to show you this, and then I'm going to stop the thing and skip ahead to the very end. I had a bunch of slides. I didn't know how fast I was going to talk, and I do this. Sorry, Dylan. But take a look at this. Before Birmingham, 4% of Americans thought civil rights was the country's most pressing issue. 4%. After Birmingham, 52%. Strike while the iron is hot. Right? Freedom rights, 1,200 activists getting arrested, thrown in jail. Birmingham, 100,000 people participated, 15,000 arrests in one city. And then, following Birmingham, between May and August of 1963, 758 demonstrations in 186 cities, 14,700 more arrests. That's now becoming a movement. Can you keep the momentum? Can you keep the momentum? That's kind of the big question, right? And then here you've got the San Francisco March in support of Birmingham. Here you've got the Great Detroit March of Freedom, hundreds of thousands of people in support of Birmingham. And then after all of that, that's when you get that March on Washington. The March on Washington is after all of that. But let me skip ahead here, because I wanted to not talk about laws very much. I wanted to talk about movement and building to this kind of stuff. The voting rights, the movement for voting rights, and so on. Look at all that. Oh, look at all of that stuff. Oh, I wanted to say that. Oh, yeah. All right. Let's get to the final piece here. Public opinion. What does it mean to a movement? I'm hoping it doesn't mean a huge amount to you. In the official story, the story of King as the great monument person, everybody was at the March on Washington. Everybody supported the sit-ins. Of course we did. Everybody supported the freedom rides. Well, we did polling back then, and polling was pretty good. And here's what you got. Do you approve or disapprove of what the freedom riders are doing? And this is all Americans. It's not just white Americans, all Americans. 22% say, yeah, we're in favor of it. That's okay. 61, no, they're harming it. Do you think the sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations will hurt? It'll hurt the movement. This is so common. You're doing it wrong. Don't protest. Oh, your cause is correct, but you're protesting wrong. Quit doing it that way. Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, this is what we heard for a year on Black Lives Matter. That's all we heard. Even the March on Washington. There's no politician in this country. Well, there used to be maybe no politician. But look at what's your opinion about this march that we're going to have on Washington? I have a dream. All that crap. All that great stuff. 23% favorable. Right? And we got to remember that in the present. if you're going to be engaged in something, sometimes it's challenging real power, and they're going to fight back, and this is what it's going to look like sometimes. This is a letter to King telling him to kill himself right before he received the Nobel Peace Prize, basically calling him a depraved animal, and we're going to reveal who you are, and blah, 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 blah. It's a long letter, and it was sent by the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and COINTELPRO. It was sent by the FBI, basically trying to get him out of the movement. He was enemy number one. So, lessons. There we go. Lessons for me. 1, don't wait for leaders to show up. They'll show up at some point. You kind of need leaders, right? But you want popular sovereignty. Movements have leaders and deal with electoral politics, but they are also organized as social movements. Social movements. And almost none of us are going to be leaders. Almost all of us are going to be just movement people. Expect massive resistance. Expect people to tell you that you're doing it wrong. There are no permanent victories, as we know. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted. I don't know if you know this, but the Voting Rights Act is gone almost. We need to get it back. Pessimism of the intellect. Recognize where we are, but then realize that we can change things. People with a lot fewer tools than we have actually did something in the world. The final one for this audience with lots and lots of union folks, good old Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. And that's all I've got for you, and we'll hand it over to Dessalines.
All right, how's everybody doing? All right, I do not have 100 slides, not at all. I think I have maybe 4 or 5. Keith told me to keep this at like 15, 20 minutes, and my clock is already going. So yeah, this is gonna be pretty quick. I knew when I talked with Paul that he was gonna cover most of what I was gonna talk about anyway, so I'm not gonna regurgitate that. Towards the end, throughout, I'm gonna do more of a rallying call type of thing, and we'll go from there, right? I'm more excited about the question and answer part, so I'm glad I don't have to speak for a long time. I also didn't do a lot of slides because I recently graduated from Fresno State. Oh, thank you. So I am completely burned out when it comes to I can't do it anymore. But yeah, my name is Dessalines Yamoussou, and I'm actually from Washington, D.C. Okay, I grew up 5 blocks from the White House. I used to ride my bike down the steps of the Capitol like every day. I'd ride all the way down to the Lincoln Memorial, come back the other way. I just thought they were like cool buildings and monuments and stuff. I had no idea what their significance was when I was a kid. Now I know what it is today. Okay, and I feel special, kinda, being from DC because I feel like we're kind of connected to a lot of the things that are going on when it comes to history, right? So Dylan talked about the fact that this was supposed to happen in February, right? February is Black History Month, right? One of the things that I like, and Paul talked about memories. One of the things that I like talking about with my students is, does anybody know how Black History Month comes about? Anybody know that? It's a mystery, right? Right. What they usually say is, well, it's in February because they wanted to give us the shortest month on the calendar. Right? I get that all the time. Okay. Actually, Dr. Woodson, Carter G. Woodson, picked February. Okay. He was an African American, and he's one of the first people to really study African American history. So in a way, we're all here tonight because of him. Right. And he decided that it would be in February, and he actually picked the second week. He was only given a week, so he picked the second week in February. Oh, David, how you doing? He picked the second week in February because there's 2 important birthdays in February. Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Okay, they're both in the second week in February. So that's why. Okay, it was called Negro History Week originally, and now it's Black History Month. Okay, Gerald Ford is the president who extended it to the whole month. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that we tend to not remember when you were talking about memories. Okay, Professor Kirk couldn't be here tonight. She would have done a way better job than me. But unfortunately, she did injure herself, and she's not here. Okay. I first met Professor Kirk when I was a student here, and I actually came from LA with an associate's degree already in film and digital media, and planned on continuing that. And she was very persuasive in getting me to switch my major. Okay. And she told me the first day, she was like, if you go and get a master's degree, I'll give you a job when you come back. Okay. That was about 9 years ago, and here I am. All right. I thought that was pretty cool. Professor Kirk's like the best. She's the best. She's my mentor. And I remember she was talking about her taking over this program. Anybody know what the Rampage is? I don't know how do you do the?
It's the top.
Ah, there we go. Anybody know what the Rampage is? Yeah, what is it? Just yell it out. It's a student newspaper, right? The student newspaper did a story on Professor Kirk when she took over African American studies here at Fresno City College. Okay, and I show this to my students all the time when we get to class. And something that I found extremely interesting about this is this passage here. Okay, I don't know if you can read it. I'll read it. In 1969, trustee Lynn B. Ford was quoted in the Rampage in response to the creation of the first African American studies classes as saying, "I don't feel this type of thing is educational. The few that want to take this course can get it someplace else other than this institution." Yeah. Okay. And the trustees are very powerful individuals. Okay. And had he had his way, we wouldn't be here today. She wouldn't be head of the program, and I wouldn't have a job. Okay. These things are disappearing. Right. This wasn't 100 years ago. Okay. I think my dad was 9 in 1960. It's like 69. Okay. So the big thing I wanted to talk about today is how we can resist today, all of us, okay, and how the echoes of the past are kind of coming forward, and we're seeing people do these kinds of things in our present, okay. So we talked about the bus boycotts. I'm not going to go too much into this, but I think boycotts work, right? That boycott led to desegregation on buses. That's amazing. Right now, people can just ride on, and it's silly when you think about it, right? People couldn't ride on buses together at one point because we all want to ride on buses, right? All right. Okay. It almost feels silly now, right? And if boycotts are something that are, that we know work, we're seeing things like DEI practices being taken out of places, right? People are removing that history in schools. Okay, you're going to go to certain places and you're not going to see certain people reflected in those places where you're shopping, right? But we're seeing people today do things like boycotts. Okay, so we're still seeing this kind of work being done. Okay, this is one of the bigger ones that are being targeted today. Okay, you got that. See, you got that. Okay, yeah, yeah. Target decided to roll back its DEI practices for some reason. And we're starting to see people, there was a rallying call for people to boycott Target. There's actually TikToks where people are walking through Targets and they're empty. Okay, I didn't shop at Target to begin with anyway, but I'll avoid it at the moment. Okay, and that rallying call came mostly from pulpits. Okay. For a 40-day boycott at Target. So we're still seeing people do this work. So my students ask me all the time, what can we do? Okay, like how can we get involved? Okay, you don't have to join Black Lives Matter. There's things that you can do in your everyday lives where you can matter. Okay, we talked earlier about making flyers for students. I'm guilty of that too. Okay, but I don't get in trouble because I don't go to my division to do it. I do it at the Veterans Center. Nobody knows me over there, so I can print away. Okay. Another one is we're starting to see more organizations and more people starting to do marches, especially after things like Ferguson, Missouri, right? And people marched because of those things, especially when Black Lives Matter were organizing all over the country. Okay, so you saw people in New York, DC, okay, Los Angeles. People are doing these things, right? So it's not like they're not happening. Okay, so I tell my students all the time, don't feel like, they did all those things back then and there's nothing we can do today. People are actually doing this stuff now. You just have to get involved. Okay, you just have to get involved. Okay, oh yeah, and that's it.